Hello. So the title of the talk is the Cascade Auction, and this is joint work with Gil Kalai and Moshe Tennenholtz, and this work was done in Microsoft in Herzliya. So I'll start with some motivations. So I'll start with ad auctions, which is a market for impressions. So in this example, you see a person watching a certain web page, and what interests the advertisers is watching this part of the web page, which is a certain advertisement. So an advertiser may want to place his advertisement on this web page, and the value of this advertisement depends on who's watching it at the moment, what impression it gives and to whom. So if it's a, let's say, a mother of young children, maybe it's more interesting for her and then more valuable for the advertiser, or in some cases more or less interesting depending on the situation. So these are the objects that we will be talking about. So it's a market for impressions. So the items for sale in this market for sale are really the end users, the people who view the ads. And the buyers in this market are the advertisers, and they are the bidders. They want to buy a certain space on this web page on which to display their advertisements. The seller or the auctioneer is whoever hosts this web page. And different advertisers have different valuations for different impressions, for different end users. So depending on who's watching the web page, it may be worth more or less for me as an advertiser to display my ad there. So usually these advertisement spaces are sold in auctions. And the motivating example for our work is a certain failure of the classical auction scenario in this setting. So in current ad exchanges, what happens is that each impression is sold using second price auction. But buyers usually don't bid directly. Instead, there are things which are called ad networks, and they serve as mediators on behalf of the buyers. A buyer enters some contract with this mediator, and the mediator does the bidding for this buyer. So the advertisers submit their bids through their ad networks, and say we have, let's say, two advertisers in a certain ad network, one, let's say, bidding 10 and the other bidding 8, and maybe another advertiser in another network bidding 5. So the first network would forward only its highest bid to the exchange, whereas each network would do the same. And then when you do second price auction, the original second price, which was 8, drops out really of the bidding. The seller never sees this second price, and he will sell this this impression. He will sell for 5 instead of 8 in the second price auction. So I assume familiarity with second price auction, which is the highest bidder wins and pays the second highest price. So in this situation, the publisher gets less revenue than you would get in the second price auction because of the structure of how things really happen in real life. So the goal of our work was to design an auction mechanism that strikes a good balance between two things. So one is the main reason why second price auctions or variants of it are used is because it's easy for bidders to decide how to bid. They can bid truthfully and know that they will not be charged more than the minimum that they could have bid in order to actually win. So we want a mechanism in which advertisers can still bid truthfully. And we want that the collusion that is implied by using mediators that have several bids coming in and they just have one bid going out from them, that it won't hurt the revenue by too much, that the price that you'd be able to charge at the end would be close to what you can charge in the second price auction. So this is our goal. Yes?
So what's the point in that every mediator is only passing on one?
So I'm not saying, so currently a mediator does not have any reason to pass more than one. What will do one bid? What will, in our auction mechanism, will give the mediator a good reason to pass more than one bid. That's really what's going on. So let me describe our mechanism. We call it the Cascade Auction. So we have some parameter k, which is at least one. Typically think of it just as being 2. And we'll have probabilities p1 up to pk in decreasing order. So p1 is larger than p2, and so on. There's some floor price, which we'll ignore in this talk. Think of it just as 0. And then when you get the bids, so I'm describing the auction without mediators. The mediators will do whatever they want. But without mediators, when the seller just receives bids, either through mediators or independent bid, doesn't matter, he sorts the bids that he gets in decreasing order from 1, let's say, just to up to k plus 1. And then the winner is declared based on a lottery. You toss a coin, and with probability p1 of getting 1, p2 of getting 2, and so on. And whatever comes up, that's the bid that wins the auction. So the highest bid wins with probability p1, the second highest bid with probability p2, and so on. The payment in a minute. So it could be that you didn't get k different bids, and in this case the item is not sold. If, let's say, if you picked, let's say, the kth highest bid and it doesn't correspond to any bidder but just to a floor price, then you just don't allocate the item in that particular case. How?
Is it k or k plus 1?
So I do the k plus 1 not just for computing the payment later. The reason to look at the first k plus 1 bids is just for the payments, not for the allocation. So for the payments, essentially you do, I will not show you the, I do show you the formula. It's essentially VCG prices. So the standard way of charging prices in order to make an auction truthful. So the winner pays like how many, like the loss he incurred to the other bidders by being in the auction, which there's a simple formula for it, which doesn't really matter. The point is that if each bidder submits one bid, in this auction, if a bidder wants to optimize his payoff, which would be the value that he gets from the auction minus the expected payment, then bidding truthfully, bidding his true value is an optimal strategy. So what would happen, just some common sense. So because of these VCG prices, which is a standard way of encouraging truthful behavior, bidders can just bid truthfully. Now what would happen if we have these mediators in the middle? Now, because not only the highest bid can win the auction, but maybe also the second highest bid, bidders would expect the mediators not to submit just one bid to the seller, but if the mediator holds several bids, to submit several bids, because also the second highest bid can win. So in this respect, the seller would get more bids. And now if P1, the probability that the first highest bid wins, is sufficiently high, then the formulas show that the revenue would be similar to that of second price auction. So this is at a high level what we would expect by common sense.
Do you have anything to stop the mediators from submitting more bids than they have?
They can do whatever they want. A mediator, we don't, I'll say a bit more about the mediators, but we don't assume anything from the mediators in our analysis. They can do whatever they want. And we have to show that regardless of how they behave, the system behaves well. Okay. So I'll get to this in a minute, okay? So this is the common sense. And now, like, what's the rest of the talk? So in a sense, I view it as an exercise in mathematical modeling in the sense that I want to provide a formal model and formal theorems to support what I just said by common sense. So it's not that it will give us somehow I think in a lot of things in game theory and economics, common sense really tells you a lot of the story, and the theorems are just something that you do in order to publish the papers later. So in a sense, that's also what's going here in my mind. Like the question is, how can you model this? How can you prove theorems about it and say something? And once you say it, it would not be very different from what I said by common sense. And what are some of the subtleties that we have to handle? So one thing that changes in this auction compared to different auctions is that a bidder may want to submit several bids and not just one bid. If you submit one bid, the VCG prices tells you you better submit your value. But maybe you want to submit several bids because maybe you want to be not only on the first slot, but also on the second slot. So this is one thing you need to handle. So what happens? And other questions is like, what are the mediators going to do when they're faced with such an auction? Like, what would they pass on when they get, let's say, bids from the bidders? What would they do with these bids? They also have maybe some incentives to do something, and you don't know exactly what they are. So how do you argue about this? So one issue is that the seller, okay, as we said, the seller has one item for sale, and there are multiple buyers, and the mechanism will allow buyers to submit multiple bids. And there's some sense in it. And in a sense, it's in the interest of the seller that the buyer would submit multiple bids, because in principle, it can increase the revenue. So how does a bid look like? It says the name of the bidder and the bid that he specifies. So there could be a bid saying bidder 1 bids 10, and another bid saying bidder 1 bids 7. And both are legitimate bids. And they can coexist together. And if I didn't describe before what happens if there is tie between different bids, so the tie-breaking mechanism has to be, there's a certain subtlety here that I will not go into it. You have to randomize between the bidders that gave the same bid, rather than randomize between the different bids. Because if a certain bidder gave 7 times the same bids and another bidder gave it just once, you don't want the bidder who gave 7 times the same bids to get a probability 7 times higher of getting the item. Otherwise, bad things can happen. So, but that's essentially think that the ties are broken at random. Okay, so what is a collusion? So that's a set of buyers that coordinate their bids. This is just in general what a collusion is. And in our case, the collusion is de facto implemented by these mediators that receive many bids, see all of them, and decide what to do. So it's a sort of collusion. We view the mediator as a bidding algorithm, so it receives the bids from the buyers. The buyer can tell the mediator whatever it wants. And then it runs a certain algorithm, and this algorithm is known to the buyers. And then they can decide, it's like a contract between the mediator and the buyers. The mediator gets the inputs from the buyers, runs its algorithm, and acts according to the output of the algorithm. So what, again, is a mediator? So it's a function from its incoming bids to at most k bids on behalf of those buyers. No point in submitting more than k bids because the auction mechanism anyway considers only the k highest bids. So buyers don't need to go through a mediator. So a buyer can submit the bids directly to the seller and also through one or more mediators. So a buyer can submit multiple bids, some through mediators, some directly to the seller. A buyer that submits bids only directly to the seller, we call it an independent buyer, Likewise, a bid that arrives directly to the seller, not through a mediator, is called an independent bid. Now, what can a mediator do and not do? So a mediator can just, the rules of the game are that the mediator can submit bids on behalf of the buyers, not necessarily the same value that the buyer bid. He can replace these values. But any bid that the mediator submits has to have a name of a buyer associated with it and a certain bid value. And then if the bid wins, he has to give that item to that buyer on behalf of which he submitted this bid.
And the buyers cannot have fake names, so they cannot have multiple names, the same buyer.
So there's, in some sense, it doesn't need multiple names. You can submit multiple bids. You can.
If you want to give the same bid many times.
You can. Okay.
You want to be considered as
Okay. Yeah. So.
Because of the tie breaking.
Yeah. So the tie. So I should say that the tie breaking. It's just, in a sense, a technical issue. It's not very important to the. It's just in the sense that would happen more. It would become a problem if people bid just above the reserved price, give many, many bids at that level. For the high bids, it doesn't really matter. Okay, it doesn't so much affect the revenue. It just affects somehow like the ease of use of the system, how easy it is to use the system. If you know that you can submit many parallel bids, you start to speculate how many should I really submit many or not, and so on. And this is not for your higher bid. That's not where you'll speculate, but really you'd give your true value as one bid and many other close to the floor price. And there's no end on how many you want to submit. If by giving more, you have more higher chance of winning it at the floor price. That's really the problem there. So.
Are you claiming that this version of Vickrey with stealing these lotteries is Bayesian incentive compatible?
So I'm not clear. So the problem is, okay, I'll get to it in a minute, in the sense that if you submit only one bid, it's clear what you have to do. If you submit many bids, it's not clear what you have to do.
Even if you submit one bid, it's not incentive compatible.
No, then it's, you have dominant strategies with one bid. With these VCG prices, yeah. The way I set the payment, it's VCG.
It's not exposed, is it? I mean, because if you know the outcomes of the coin, you know what actually comes out of the lotteries, you may be unhappy with your bid. Right?
You mean exposed?
It's not dominant strategy.
In
It's only bid.
expectation.
Okay. So I mean, if you want to, maximize your expected, yeah, in a sense, it's a randomized mechanism. So I look at your expected payoff and to maximize your a priori yeah.
So there's a business equilibrium for this thing, obviously, but I mean,
Okay. So we don't get, in fact, we will not try to do exact equilibrium analysis in the sense that we don't know what the mediators are going to do. We don't exactly model them, so we'll try to get around this issue of doing exact analysis and still say something meaningful. So the Cascade Auction, we will look at it as a multiplayer game. So let's think of the set of the mediators as fixed. Each one of them published his mediation algorithm. And now we get a game just between the buyers. And an action of a player in that game, which is a buyer, is to submit two types of bids. The AI is a set of bids that it submits independently, directly to the seller. And AC here is bids submitted to the different mediators. And you can submit both independent bids and bids through the mediator. And that's the game, and each player wants to maximize, in our case, the expected payoff, because it's a randomized mechanism. And the question is, are the mediators also players in this game? Because they also have some strategic objectives. And the point is that we can do the analysis while circumventing this question. We will not care if they have strategic objectives or not. It will not matter. So first, so what can we say in this case? So first, let's look at a naive buyer. So a naive buyer is a buyer that is independent, doesn't use the mediators at all, and submits just one bid. So in this case, he has a dominant action, which is just to bid his value because of these VCG prices. That's a naive buyer. We can also think of non-naive buyers. And here's one thing that would help us later. We can, let's look at the special case where k equals 2, just the two highest bids might win. So the question is, if he wants to submit independent bids, when is it worth for him to submit 2 independent bids rather than just 1? And let's say he knows what all the other bids are, then there's a simple formula that says when is it good to submit another bid. So if you are first, you may want also to capture the second slot, to bid just above the slot, just above the second highest bid and capture also the second slot. But then if you win, you might pay more because of the VCG prices. If you win with the first slot, you'd pay more. And the break-even point, there's some formula that says if your own value plus the average of your value and the second highest bid is larger. So, okay, these are by the other bidder. Your value is supposedly higher than B1 and B2, then if your value with the third really highest bid is larger than the second highest bid, the average of these two, then it's worth making another bid. So, okay, so you can do these computations. So now let's look at what I'll call a naive mediator. So what is a naive mediator? It just asks each buyer for his bids, sorts all these bids, and passes the k highest bids to the seller. So this is really what happened in the original auction setting that we had before, that you just pass the highest bid. Now you pass all those bids that have a chance of winning. That's a naive mediator, and in a sense, it's a reasonable mediator, that this is what maybe the buyers would expect to happen. So if all mediators are naive, then in every, now we don't want to do an exact equilibrium analysis here, and there are no dominant strategies. So what we look at is undominated actions by the players. So an undominated action is a sort of bids that he submits that there's nothing that is obviously better than them. So whenever buyers do things that are not obvious mistakes, let's call them, the following would happen. They would not submit independent bids. It's always better to go through a mediator, because going through a mediator, you might cause some other bid to drop from the auction, which is good for you. You'd pay less. If you submit multiple bids, it's always all of them through the same mediator. You can show that that's good. And your highest bid would be exactly your value, and maybe you have additional bids which are lower. That's what would happen if there are only naive mediators. And now for the rest of the talk, we'll look just at the case where k equals 2, and then the probability that the first highest bid wins, we'll call it P, and the 3 highest value held by buyers will be V1, V2, and V3, just for saying what the results are. So if we have naive mediators, you can prove that the expected revenue of the seller is at least 2P minus 1 times V2. So if P is close to 1, this is almost the second highest value, which is similar to second price auction, even though you have these mediators, as long as they are naive. And the question is now, what happens if they are not naive? They do more crazy things, these mediators. And now we have a way of circumventing the need to model exactly what the mediators do. And this is because players can also be independent. And the reason is the way we're going to do it, we're going to look at Nash equilibria for the players when they can also be independent. And we will be able to argue that if mediators do crazy things, the players would be better off just submitting an independent bid. That's like the way we will be able to avoid modeling exactly what the mediators do, by saying, if we look at the bids that the seller gets, if they somehow look too low and the seller doesn't get enough revenue, then some buyer would be better off submitting also an independent bid, so it cannot be an equilibrium. So, so in any such, okay, so we have a formula saying what the revenue would be in any Nash equilibrium. That we didn't exactly specify what the mediators do, but whatever they do in any Nash equilibrium, the revenue would be, okay, depending on some, if the second highest value V2 is very small, then the revenue is just the second highest value. And if it's larger, then the revenue, you can think of it as at least either the third highest value or half the first value times, again, something that would be close to 1 if P is close to 1. So this says that in all these Nash equilibria, we have a lower bound on the revenue of the seller, which is a reasonable lower bound. We have also what we call semi-best responses of buyers. So this is a weaker notion than a general Nash equilibrium, and hence more general. So here I'm thinking of when a buyer makes his bids, he knows what happens with his independent bids. They go to the seller. He doesn't know exactly what happens with the bids that go through the mediators, because he doesn't maybe see what other buyers gave the mediator, so he doesn't know what exactly would happen. So this is, we say that the buyer has a semi-best response if only the portion of his independent bid is optimized, and he's not optimizing his bids through the mediators because he doesn't know how to optimize them. So this would be a semi-Nash profile if every buyer at least just optimizes his independent bids, but with the other bids it does arbitrary things.
So in the other, you did the Nash.
Sorry?
With the Nash.
Yes.
So you don't know the bounds of the other players.
Yeah, so no, in Nash equilibrium in a sense says that, in a sense, the definition says that you know what happens everywhere. Okay. Because you are a best response against whatever happens. Here you don't know what happens everywhere. No, in Nash, no, it's not Bayesian Nash. I'm not talking about Bayesian Nash. Yeah. So this is I'm saying in that, I'm just saying that if you are at a Nash equilibrium, you have this lower bound on the revenue. And here it's not a Nash. It's something weaker than a Nash. And the bounds are quite similar to before. Even then, the difference is now before V2 was not multiplied by 2p minus 1, and here it is. That's the difference. So even in that case, we have a reasonable lower bound on the revenue. Okay, so you can try to analyze more scenarios like Bayesian settings and things like that. We didn't try to do it. So I'll conclude here. So what we did, we have this Cascade Auction, which is a sealed bid auction of a single item, and the winner is chosen at random according to some fixed probability distribution, and pays some VCG price. And our analysis should gives evidence, let's say, from several directions that the revenue is probably going to be not much lower than in a second price auction, even if there is collusion, or even if there are mediators. And some principles of the analysis, how did we do some analysis? So first, we looked at some special cases that we think are informative in the sense that we expect some agents to behave this way. So what happens if there are naive buyers or naive mediators? And then to do more sophisticated analysis, we looked at cases of multiple bids by the same buyer, and then these independent bids allow reasoning about outcomes without specifying exactly what the mediators do. Like all the analysis is based just what happens with the independent bids. Then we looked at undominated actions, and this is a way of trying to circumvent equilibrium analysis. I think undominated actions, in a sense, is something more natural to me that people would actually do. And also we looked at these Nash and semi-Nash profiles, again, as a way of quantifying over all reasonable contracts offered by the mediators. So here the analysis was, regardless of what the contract is, at least in Nash equilibria or semi-Nash equilibria, we know that the revenue is not going to be too small. Okay, so that's it.
Questions? So what do you gain by taking k to be more than 2?
So you'd get different expressions. I'm not sure. So there are other reasons why you may want to increase k. So theoretically, the question is you can prove things mathematically, but not necessarily believe that they will happen in real life. So theoretically, you can gain everything that you want just in a sense by making p very, very close to 1 and assume that just the fact that the second player has a chance of winning, this would be enough as an incentive to give additional bids. Not clear if it will happen in real life. With 3, you get some more flexibility, let's say, of what you do. Another reason maybe to use this auction, which we didn't analyze, is it's not just an auction, it's partly also a lottery. You may give a small bid and get a large reward. And this may encourage participation in such auctions, and you know that in auctions you want a lot of participations because this determines the revenue of auctions. So if you make k larger, maybe you'll encourage more people to participate. That could be another reason. And not in these ad auctions, I think, but maybe in other auctions.